You know, I gotta be honest here. I'm kind of nervous about making this video simply because I know a good amount of people within the audience will disagree with my take on the matter, but I'm gonna come out and say it. Spectacular Spider-Man, despite being only 26 episodes, which equal to 2 seasons, was a better adaptation of Spider-Man than any film, video game, or any of the other cartoons that have been released in the years following the show's cancellation, or I should say unofficial cancellation. On the other hand, some of you might say, what's the problem, Grim? That doesn't sound like much of a controversial take in your eyes. Well, the thing is, when it comes to Spider Man or any of the other popular superheroes most of us have come to love while growing up, you never know how, your take will be, how people will view your take. But in this video, I'm going to take the opportunity with the re release of No Way Home around the corner to talk about the little blimp known as Spectacular Spider Man, a show I feel has been almost entirely forgotten in the eyes of a lot of people in recent years. When it comes to Spider-Man, you mainly hear about Tobey Maguire's films or the 90s cartoons as the definitive version of Spider-Man in their eyes. You still got people who mention Andrew Garfield's films or the recently completed Tom Holland trilogy, but most of what I brought up tend to be the most common examples used on the internet these days in these type of discussions. It's why I felt the need to remind people about a little cartoon that somehow, despite being intended to be a kid show, managed to be a more faithful adaptation of the character than I think anyone expected it to be, and frankly, any than the show had any right to be. Now that I finally have that out of the way, why don't we begin the video? No film, cartoon, or video game has been able to properly showcase the struggles faced by Peter Parker like the Spectacular Spider Man managed to do. In fact, more than any other, Spectacular Spider Man put on screen the most relatable version of the character to this day. And before anyone says it, I understand. People are probably tired of the high school setting. We've seen numerous, and I mean numerous iterations of the wall crawler spending his days at Midtown High. We had the latest being Tom Holland's trilogy of films where Peter Parker spent all three of them in high school. However, there's something a little different about Spectacular Spider-Man's attempt at the character, or I should say at the whole backdrop. It's an exception to the rule because it does something, with the whole scenery, with the whole setting that it takes place in. What we see throughout the 26 episodes is a Peter Parker dealing with the realities of being in his junior year. Included in that list would be an ever changing group of friends, romance, school, work, and all while trying to keep his superhero alter ego a secret from those around him. That is where I think the show, in my mind, does a far better job at depicting the realities of high school, better than even Tom's films, which started from his sophomore year all the way to his senior year. I should even mention he technically has been, Spider Man since his freshman year, as he did pop up in Civil War at that time. But the writers of Spectacular Spider Man could have left the whole high school backdrop and done nothing with it, yet they chose to try. You see, there's always the same old stereotypes whenever high school is brought up in a conversation or depicted in some form of media. You have the nerd, aka Peter, attempting to ask out one of the cute cheerleaders and gets humiliated by the girl in the process. And everybody's laughing at the guy, right? You have the group of jocks who make the nerds, all the nerds in the school make their lives miserable. Hell, his friends are in the same boat as him, right? And you also have that cute, nerdy female friend who's very much clearly into the main character, right? For God's sakes, you even have the cliche hot cheerleader needs to be tutored by nerdy character trope in the first couple of episodes. Seriously, everything I just said makes it sound like a watered down version of Degrassi if you take the chance to think about it. and with a little less Drake in it, I should say. So, here's the impressive thing, though, about Spectacular Spider Man. It took those same stereotypes we know about the high school genre and, actually evolved them. Those bullies, Peter, while never truly befriending them throughout the entire series, comes to get along with them over the course of the entire show. Towards the end of the second season, he goes with them in a group to the dance, for God's sakes. As for those same stuck-up cheerleaders, remember how I mentioned a particular trope about a nerdy guy getting the chance to tutor a hot cheerleader? Well, let's just say Peter left quite the impression on Liz Allen, as she, of all people, would eventually end things with the star quarterback of their school, and Peter's primary bully for most of high school, Flash Thompson, in order to be with Peter. Hell, she actually improved her grades after taking her tutoring sessions with Peter seriously. You know, the thing is, Liz Allen, more than most, is an example of taking the stereotypical cheerleader who's stuck up and obsessed with popularity and turning her into an actual character. The best part is, others receive the same treatment like Flash Thompson as the series progresses. I mean, this guy was dating Liz Allen, a hot cheerleader, in the first episode. By the end, he's trying to impress a girl from the drama club. That's a pretty big 180 in my mind, especially from my own experience in high school. However, Peter's life as a high school student extends beyond the walls of the classroom as he comes to the realization everyone deals with. Life tends to throw a curveball, and unfortunately, there's no real way to avoid them. You just gotta take a swing and hope to God you can hit it. Whether it's friendships coming apart, dealing with family, and trying to keep his grip on the responsibilities of being Spider Man. And here's the next thing, though, that leads us into the conversation regarding the dynamic between, you know, Peter Parker and Spider Man. Like many of the great superheroes we've come to know and love growing up, Peter Parker managed to etch out his own place on the comic book pantheon and gain an immense popularity, rivaled only by Batman and maybe a few other select characters ever. And this is probably due to one single reason. Underneath the mask, he was just your average ordinary guy without a care in the world. Well, I should hold back on the last part because that's not entirely true. And this is where Spectacular Spider-Man comes into play. The show, more than most, put on full display the tumultuous nature of Peter's life due to being the wall crawler. You have numerous cases of him being late to school, constantly bailing on his friends to take care of a villain, or missing dates later on in the series after he started dating Liz Allen. It leads to so many people in his life doubting him, wondering if he was reliable or worth keeping around. All of these, all of this emotional weight culminated in one of the more defining moments of the show when Peter, after curing Dr. Connor of his rather scaly affliction, contemplated taking the very same concoction with the hope of curing himself in order to have a real life again.
Except I saved him. Spider-Man's no magic wand, but thanks to the webhead, Kurt's cured, and Billy gets his father back. So what if nobody threw a parade? Spidey stays because Spidey's needed. For now, anyway.
Sometimes, life isn't always a yellow brick road. But for Peter Parker, the guy always makes do with what he got. However, above anything else, he understands the good someone like Spider-Man can bring to the table. Not many other iterations of the character can claim the same thing. Spider-Man 2 and PS4 Spider-Man are the sole exceptions to the rule, however. But instead of focusing on the headaches of being Spider-Man, Peter chooses to look at the good being the wall crawler brings to the world. Yet, in spite of everything he's done as Spider-Man, Those courageous feats won't ever win him some popularity contest at school. Hell, he goes out of his way to appear as weak as the typical nerd just so he can stay under the radar of everyone around him, so no one ever suspects anything of him. It's a harsh kind of dynamic that's played out, especially with the ever so famous water balloon scene. But I also think it's important to keep into perspective why I believe many of the other iterations don't do the kind of job Spectacular Spider-Man did in showing the dynamic between Peter and his masked alter ego. For a show aimed at kids, it did pretty well in showing the realities of being a superhero in high school. It also does remind me of another show that just so happens to, involve superheroes and the responsibilities of being one at a young age, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, the last example I want to use in regards to the dynamic between Peter and Spider-Man is none other than the introduction of Venom. The writers managed to depict the friendship between Peter and Eddie Brock in such a glowing manner, showing how close they are at the beginning of the season, or I should say the first season. However, it deteriorates as, Peter's, continues in Eddie's mind to ruin his life and ruin the opportunities that, that was there for Eddie. A hatred began to fester in Eddie Brock, and that culminated in the birth of Venom, a villain who knew every detail of Peter's life, and someone more than willing to do whatever it takes to destroy Peter Parker and Spider-Man, regardless of who gets hurt in the process.
This is all Spider-Man's fault! He destroyed my son! If I ever get my hands on that wall crawler,
You want the wall crawler?
No!
Then here's a scoop. Peter Parker is Spider-Man!
This entire situation led to so many people coming to the front door of the truth, but none of them were able to believe it because why? It's Peter Parker. He's a nerd. He's not reliable. How can someone like him be a great hero like Spider-Man? It's why I still hold this show above every other iteration of the character, even the Insomniac version of the character, who is fantastic in so many different ways. Still falls a little short of what was created for a kid's cartoon. But since we're on the topic of characters and the differences out there in the entertainment space, I do think it's time to have a conversation regarding how Spectacular Spider-Man handled the characters we have come to know over the years. Peter, in just about any other video, would have been the most obvious example for me to cover. But in my eyes, a really good example of staying true to their original characters is Mary Jane Watson.
Do you mean you're Mary Jane Watson?
Face it, Tiger. You just hit the jackpot.
I mean, this is literally a comic book page coming to life. Spectacular Spider-Man somehow managed to do what a lot of other iterations of the character failed to do over the years. Now, I do have to make a disclaimer. I realistically can't go into every version of Mary Jane out there because this video would be way longer than I would have wanted it to be. So I'm going to pick some of the more popular versions of the character. For most people, they're probably most familiar with Kristen Dunst playing the character throughout the Tobey Maguire films. Unfortunately, she was best known for being a screamer at most. And not in that way, ladies and gentlemen. The other live-action version of the character is played by Zendaya in the Tom Holland films. See, we have a slight problem there because when it comes to being Mary Jane, she's pretty much the opposite of the character in a lot of ways. It's almost to the point where, other than having the initials of MJ and having the Watson last name, there's not much of a connection between them. There's also a third unofficial live-action version of Mary Jane. She was originally slated to be in the second Amazing Spider-Man and played by Shailene Woodley. Still weird to know she dated Aaron Rodgers at one point, but that's besides the point. And look, I could go into the numerous animated versions of the character of the 90s cartoon, Spider-Man Unlimited, and the weird 3D animated one from MTV. The problem is, most people, not the hardcore fans of Spider-Man, like those of you watching the film, or me, or maybe even those of us on the channel, don't really watch these series. I personally enjoy some of these shows. Maybe I can make some videos talking about some of these, especially Spider-Man Unlimited, a really underrated show that had little to work with. But the point I'm trying to get across is Mary Jane and Spectacular Spider-Man went from being a pleasant surprise all the way to becoming probably one of Peter's closest friends by the end of the show. And guess what? She had the most impact on Peter's life, not Spider-Man's. The same can be said for a variety of characters like Gwen, Harry, Liz, and so many others. Another big one is Harry Osborn. The guy went from being Peter's best friend to absolutely resenting him for a number of reasons. Jealous of his own father seeming to prefer Peter over him, resorting to rather dicey things to impress his father. I think that's a big criticism I can throw at some of the more recent versions of the character, especially the cartoon from 2017. This, in my mind, is why myself and many others will say this show is the best iteration of the character, even over the Tobey films or the PS4 Spider-Man. The one that might get me flack, but I'm willing to stand by my comment. I know the popularity of the games, but I'm willing to stand by my comment on that regards. So when you put all this together, you come to a single conclusion. Am I saying every other version of Spider-Man put on the big screen or television screen is worse than Spectacular Spider-Man? No, because I'm not egotistical enough to think that way. But I think in recent years, Spectacular Spider-Man kind of seems like an afterthought whenever conversations regarding the best version of the character comes up in conversation these days. So I wanted to take the chance to remind people why this show, prior to Tom's films or the PS4 game, was talked about as the best version of not only the character of Peter Parker, but so many others associated with the wall crawler, which includes his rogue gallery as well. All of this points to a single conclusion for me. I wish those involved in the show got their chance to do another season. It's a shame what happened, but I'm simply going out of my way to remind people about a cartoon that managed to stay at the top of the mountain for a number of years until it was slowly dethroned and all but forgotten in the eyes of the new fans over the last several years. I could also be making this more dramatic than it needs to be. I wouldn't blame anyone for coming to such a conclusion. However, after concluding over a decade ago, I think it's only right to bring up a show which deserves to be mentioned, even to this very day.
Go ahead, try. How I Spent My Summer Vacation by Peter Benjamin Parker. I can sum it up in one glorious, hyphenated word. Spider-Man. I am the Spectacular Spider-Man!